This is Chapter 3, Lecture A, the plasma membrane, cell junctions, and introduction to the cell. So we're going to follow along with the first part of Chapter 3. And first of all, a cell is the fundamental unit of life. So it's the fundamental unit of life. And there are many different cells, as you can see on this picture here. It's the same picture that you have in figure 3.1. It shows the extreme amount of cellular diversity that we have in our body. And again, these cells, they represent what is the principle of complementarity of structure and function. So remember, this was kind of a theme that we talked about in Chapter 1, the complementarity of structure and function. And all this really says is that structure complements function. And we know the word structure means anatomy, and the word function means physiology. So whatever the structure of the particular cell is going to sort of represent or complement the specific function. So the biochemical activities, the events that occur in the cell, are really dictated by how the cell is actually shaped. And we see some examples of this here. We see some examples for when we look at the erythrocyte, for example. The erythrocyte is the red blood cell, and we'll notice that it has a large surface area. And this surface area represents the structure of it, and it has this large surface area so that it can transport an abundance of oxygen. So again, the structure represents the function. We have other examples like epithelial cells. These epithelial cells, we see them specifically lining the kidney tubules, and again, that's going to reflect its specific function. Muscle cells are going to be shaped a certain way that will allow them to contract. So to allow contraction, we have fat cells. A fat cell would be called an adipocyte. And an adipocyte is filled with lipid droplets. So these lipid droplets are going to be for energy storage. And again, the specific way that this cell is shaped is excellently designed just for this specific function. The macrophage, which is a type of it's actually derived from a white blood cell, but it's going to help to fight disease. So it can attach to certain areas and sort of wiggle its way through certain areas. The nerve cell is very long, as you can see here, and it allows for communication. So some nerve cells can actually be 1 entire meter. And then the sperm cell, this last one, is actually the only example of the cell in the human body that actually has a flagella. And it has this flagella so that it is able to swim. And so in this case, the sperm swims to the egg in order for development to occur. So our next slide is showing an example of a generalized or a common cell. And the three main parts of the common cell would be the plasma membrane, and we'll talk more about the plasma membrane coming up. But the plasma membrane is going to sort of act like the gatekeeper. It maintains the outer boundary of a cell. So remember that this was one of the examples of the necessary functions of life back that we talked about in Chapter 1. The second major part would be the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is really made up of watery fluid, which is called cytosol, as well as all of the different structures in it, the sort of what I like to refer to as mini organs, and they're called the organelles. The third part then would be the nucleus, which is the control center of the cell. It's where the DNA is going to be found. And so the generalized structure of the cell, you have the same figure in your book on figure 3.2. And we're going to talk more in depth coming up in a sequential mini lecture on all of the different organelles here. But you should know the functions for these different organelles. So let me kind of highlight them Real quickly, the plasma membrane is the gatekeeper of the cell. The nucleus is the control center. Nuclear envelope is the membrane that surrounds the nucleus. The chromatin is a form of DNA. The nucleolus is where RNA is stored. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum is where lipids are made. The cytosol is the watery fluid in the cytoplasm. The mitochondria is where ATP is made. Lysosome is where there are bacteria that can be destroyed. It has strong enzymes in it. The centrioles are for cell division. The centrosome matrix is made up of 2 centrioles. The cytoskeletal elements include the microtubule, intermediate filaments, and they're going to be very important for the structure of the cell. Peroxisome has peroxide in it that destroys other non-functional parts. Golgi apparatus is where proteins are manufactured. Ribosomes would be where proteins are made, as well as the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So we'll talk more about those in greater depth later on. So this next slide is showing the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is a very, very important part, and the first thing it does is it separates the extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid. So ECF is the extracellular fluid, and it's important that you know what the components of this are. So the extracellular fluid is the fluid that's going to be found outside of the cell, and it is going to contain primarily sodium and chloride. The ICF is the intracellular fluid, so this would be where we would find the cytosol, and it's going to contain potassium as well as negatively charged amino acid. The IF is a little different, and it's actually a part of the extracellular fluid. So I'm going to represent this kind of simply here. We have a cell. The intracellular fluid would be the ICF, which is inside of it. And then there is another barrier here. This is going to represent a blood vessel. The blood vessel would be the extracellular fluid, and everything in this area is also extracellular fluid. But since it would actually be found between the cells, it's going to be interstitial fluid. So it really would be the IF, which is a type of extracellular fluid, which is an important concept to understand. So when we look at our plasma membrane, first of all, it's described as a fluid mosaic model. The fluid mosaic model really means that it is a mix of several different types of compounds. It's a mix of phospholipids. So the phospholipids make up a very large part of this membrane. It's also going to be a mix of glycolipids, cholesterol, as well as some other proteins that are going to be scattered within it. Now the word mosaic means that it's kind of a hodgepodge, a mix of different types of chemicals. So there's really no organization to it at all. A mosaic is sort of if you were to take paint and you were just to randomly throw it at a canvas. That would look like a mosaic, if you will. So the most important part of this plasma membrane is the phospholipid. So let's take some time to look at the phospholipid. A phospholipid is going to have a circular area facing the outside, and this circular area here is the polar hydrophilic region. So it means water loving. So it's a polar head, and this polar head again is hydrophilic. So it's naturally going to orient itself towards the water. Whereas the inside of the phospholipid is going to be the nonpolar portion, and it's going to be hydrophobic. It's going to be sort of afraid of the water, so it's naturally going to orient itself away from the water. So the result that we see is the plasma membrane here, and the great thing about the plasma membrane, it is very fluid as well. So the part of this word fluid mosaic, fluid, means that the membrane is bendable. So the membrane can bend. It can sort of adapt to its surroundings, which is very important. So if, for example, a red blood cell, if it has to go into a very small area, it needs to be able to bend and be able to kind of get into that smaller area. The glycolipids, the second part of the plasma membrane, they are going to be found kind of on the outer surface of the plasma membrane, and they can be kind of sticking out, as we see in this case. They can be sticking out to act as receptors or signals that will allow other molecules to be able to recognize that specific cell. And then the cholesterol, as I mentioned, is going to lead to the fluidity. So the more cholesterol we have in our plasma membranes, the more fluid it's going to be. The more that specific cell can actually bend and adapt to its surroundings. The other important structure that we have in these membranes are proteins. So this, for example, would be a protein. It would be an integral protein that we see here, and this one would be a peripheral protein. Proteins have many different functions. Proteins can function as pores, meaning they can allow molecules to either enter the cell or exit the cell. They can also act as carriers, and these carriers would allow another molecule to bind to them. They can also allow for communication within the cell. So once a certain molecule binds to the outside of a cell, then there can be communication deep within the cell then. This slide is showing the different examples of proteins, and you have this in the next figure in your book. This would be figure 3.4, and you should be able to recognize these different examples. So our first one is transport, and in the transport example, we see that there is an integral protein that really spans the entire plasma membrane in this case. So what's going to happen is there is a molecule that can enter or exit. In this case, we have one that enters and one that exits. So it can enter or exit the cell. And this is very, very prevalent all throughout the body. So an example of this would be the ability of glucose to enter the cell. So glucose enters the cell via this mechanism. Another example would be signal transduction. So there is a certain signal that is going to bind to a protein, and then there is a change that happens inside the cell. So this happens specifically with chemical messengers and other hormones. One example of this would be adrenaline. Adrenaline, which is epinephrine, adrenaline is going to bind to a receptor and cause a change within the cell. So in other words, this tells the inside of the cell to start performing a certain activity. This is a structural ability of proteins here, where there can actually be attachments within what's called the extracellular matrix, but it can lead to the cell shape. There can also be proteins that act as enzymes. So in this case, this would actually be an enzyme where there's a chemical reaction that occurs. One common example of this is when a chemical binds to a receptor, there is going to be a chemical reaction where a second messenger is actually produced. A common second messenger is cyclic AMP, produced from ATP. So this would be the protein in the membrane, and this protein acts as an enzyme. In this case, the enzyme is called adenylate cyclase. But the great thing about this is that the second messenger, the chemical that's produced, is then going to trigger other events within the cell. So the protein can act as an enzyme is the important point here. Proteins can help with cell-to-cell recognition to recognize another cell. So for example, this is how antigens and antibodies work. So an antibody could recognize a specific molecule, a specific bacteria, from cell-to-cell recognition. The other one is intercellular joining. This is going to connect two cells, as you can see, to allow them to stick together. Our next slide is showing the different cell junctions, and there's three that you need to be aware of. The first is a tight junction. We want tight junctions in our body where we can't afford to allow any molecules to pass from one side of the membrane to another. Now, this is kind of a generalized example because there's not one cell in the body that's going to have all three of these. The tight junctions, for example, they're going to be impermeable, so they're not going to let any molecules to pass from one side to the other. And the best example of this is found in the GI tract. So imagine that this would be where the blood would be on this side of the membrane. And actually, better yet, we're going to say that this is going to be the blood here, and this is going to be the GI tract. So we have food that's being digested, we have small monomers, let's say we have glucose, we have fatty acids, we have amino acids, and we have eventually what's going to end up being secreted, what we're going to excrete from our body. And we certainly do not want any of these bacteria that are in the digestive system to get into the blood. That would be very, very bad, lead to some potentially deadly problems. So it's very important that we have these tight junctions present to prevent anything like that from actually happening. So tight junctions, the best example of tight junctions that we're going to find are found in the digestive tract. The second example of tight junctions that we have would be the desmosomes. And desmosomes are anchoring. We have what kind of look like guy wires that are going to kind of act like a button-like thickening here. And what's important is that these are found in areas of the body where there is a lot of stress. So areas that are going to undergo a lot of this stress and where cells could potentially be ripped apart if we don't have these desmosomes present. So the two best examples in the body would be in the epithelium in the skin and also in the heart. So even though the heart may contract very forcefully, as depending on our activities, those cells are not going to rip apart. And the third one is the gap junction. And these gap junctions, they have specialized proteins in them called connexons. And these connexons kind of act like little tunnels. And they're tunnels that allow ions to pass. Tunnels that allow ions to pass quickly from one cell to another. So the first two that we talked about, the tight junctions and the desmosome, are going to be structural, whereas the third one is really the only one that's going to be functional. It's actually going to allow for specific molecules, specific ions to pass quickly from one cell to another. So for example, in the heart, it was one of the best examples that we find gap junctions. So the heart has both gap junctions and desmosomes, but they're for different purposes. Calcium, for example, would pass quickly from one cell to another.